Hey guys, how's it going? Jay Sensational here, welcome back to the channel. So for today's video, we're gonna do something slightly different than what I typically do for this kind of video. I wanted to do like, the classic 7 decks to play after the patch kind of video, but at the same time, I just also wanted to broaden it a little bit by talking about the overall meta, and then I hope that this gives a better picture of why I recommend certain decks, and I think it also answers some questions that I've been asked during my streams, like, oh, why is Seraphine still doing good, or like, where has Vayne gone, things like that. So let's just do a quick meta dive, look into the top decks, look into the trending stuff, and I'll recommend some decks to climb with at the end of the video. Let's just review the current direction of the meta and some of the top decks, and then I can show you guys last 7 days versus last 2 days and see how that's kind of shifted. So first of all, this is the last 7 weeks, or sorry, 7 days, and we have the top decks being Teemo Zoe, Draven Jinx, Echo Jinx, Annie Jhin. So very aggressive focused, right? Teemo Zoe is definitely one of the stronger decks that we have seen. And it continues to be the top played deck, being this elusive swarm deck, a very aggressive, but also having the ability to kind of generate some really big stats. So the ability to use cards like Draconic Bands, Darkened Lodestone, Esmus, as well as the Chimes, in addition to cards like Sudden Surge and Battle Bonds, makes it really difficult to kill them that typical other Swarm decks really didn't have access to. So if you play like a Swarm deck, you're crumbling to Avalanche, you're crumbling to like all these other like AoE removals. But this deck in particular is sort of impervious to that to a certain degree because of cards like Battle Bonds and Sudden Surge and other buff cards, and which is I think one of the reasons why it has remained such a high power level overall. And then I think you'll follow suit with some more aggressive decks over here, such as the Discard Aggro, the classic Annie Jhin, and even a little bit of the Echo Jinx that we've seen pretty popular in the last week or so. And now, of course, on the other side of that, with the top 4 decks in the last week being very predominantly aggressive slash swarm based decks, I think we have seen just a very, very high abundance of Shadow Isles control decks coming suit as well. Some of the top popular ones being the Trundle Trymir Field Rush, Heimer Jace, as well as Seraphine Victor. And it's partially the reason why I think that, when people say like, oh, I thought Seraphine would be gutted, well, it's a little bit of exception because it's more of a Shadow Isles control deck that just runs Seraphine. Whereas in the past, if we thought about Seraphine decks, it was predominantly just Seraphine is just absolutely destroying games. Now that's still the case here, but this overall is taking advantage of the fact that, a lot of the decks up here still lose the classic SI removal cards, the PNZ removal cards, and then Seraphine's just got any champion at that point is probably going to win you the game. So if we look at the last 7 days for Seraphine decks in particular, if I can find her, here we go. Like Seraphine Victor, is the leading one. You notice that Ezreal Seraphine, one of the best decks in the last patch going in, is now really, really not worth mentioning. Its win rate has reduced dramatically, is that dramatically, and that's partially due to the fact that this Seraphine Ezreal deck was a lot more of a burn down your opponent kind of game plan, right? It aimed to level up Seraphine, aimed to level up Ezreal, and then burst down your opponent. Whereas this deck is still just more of a control deck that can run you over with Seraphine later on, but it outgrinds you rather than this deck, and you see the difference in sort of win rates as reflective of that. Granted that in this aggressive meta, this deck also just doesn't have any healing. So partially due to the fact that it is a lot slower and it matters a lot more for this Ezreal Seraphine deck compared to like Ezreal Victor, for example, but also the fact that this SIPNZ just lacks heal into like this very, very aggressive meta. For the other parts, Seraphine overall is still doing okay. You notice some strong points. The Seraphine Zoe, the target one, is still doing fine. Karma Victor, You notice that there's these Bandle City or Bilgewater that are still floating around. And yeah, these are definitely propped up by Seraphine still. There's no doubt that Seraphine is still a strong card by herself, and she still does what she does, just a little bit slower. Now, for some decks, they don't really mind that, but for something like Ezreal Seraphine, that did really, really matter. And you'll notice that a lot of these are just I think you know there's definitely a lot other more cards that Seraphine definitely abuses, such as either Victor, Pack Alley Bar, Sputtering Song Spinner, that are just able to generate you a lot of value. And then these still just have very solid game plans by themselves, right? So it's no surprise that Seraphine's still doing well, although I will say that I'm a little bit surprised that I really thought Seraphine would get kind of replaced. But she's still being doing pretty well. But the only real deck that has really suffered as a result of it is this Ezreal Seraphine deck. And I think that's twofold the meta as well as the deck itself. But Seraphine overall is still propped up by the likes of Back Alley Bar and Sputtering Song Spinner. And I think that's to be expected as long as these cards sort of remain the same. Now let's go back to the overall meta and talk a little bit further. Outside of that, I think that there hasn't really been too many like interesting things popping out. Catalog has come back a little bit, and Talia Ziggs, taking advantage of the newest safety inspector buff, has sort of reached a little bit of a place here. Now this is because like this kind of deck is good in Shadow Isles control decks, and this deck is just okay overall, right? Very high skill level players can probably beat, you know, a lot of different people by playing a deck that are comfortable with, familiar with, and just a very solid deck overall, and can really abuse your opponent's plays. But as you continue, notice that, you know, just a lot of decks that are just Shadow Isles control decks have just popped up, even though they haven't really been around since past metas. You notice like Nora Vagar, Elise Vagar, Heimer Nora, Kindred Nasus. And there are just, it is just a really nice time to be an SI control deck overall. Outside of that, nothing really noticeable. A lot of same decks. Diana Leona probably one of the more interesting decks, just because I think that it definitely has a much higher win rate than something that I would suspect, having like a 55.2% win rate. But I think some of these numbers have changed over the past week into the last 2 days, and I think this is kind of interesting just to take a snapshot at where the meta is heading. You notice that in the past 2 days compared to the past 7 days, all of a sudden the top decks are no longer your aggro swarm decks, because decks like Trundle, Tryndamere, Heimer, Jace have really capitalized on the fact that, you know, these swarmy aggro decks are just really nowhere to be found, or sorry, are just getting farmed by these decks, and as a result I think they have plummeted in both play rate as well as win rate just a tad. And that's really due to the fact that there aren't really any Ionia decks to kind of punish them for this kind of play. Now I think that like Vayne decks overall still do quite well into this overall like Shadow Isles control deck kind of style, but due to the recent nerfs to Ionia decks, I think that there are definitely a lot fewer people playing them, and as a result these SI control decks have had just some room to kind of take over. I still think for the most part, you can probably play some good Seraphine decks, like if you play Seraphine Ionia, Seraphine like Bandle City, or whatever kind of like Seraphine SI, you still have a decent chance into a lot of these decks. But for especially for Trundle Tryndamere, having access to She Who Wanders as well as a lot of ramp, if you're not playing specifically Deny decks, then I feel like this is kind of the deck that has really or has a lot of room to kind of just bully everyone else out, and can be very flexible. You can run freezes, you can run vengeances, you can run avalanche plus blight ravines, you can just run ramp and into She Wanders, and this card is very good into this deck, and it's good into a lot of other control decks as well, right? Because I think a lot of control decks right now are propped up by Quietus, and She Who Wanders is kind of just Quietus but a little bit better. So definitely one of the strongest candidates for me personally as a deck that I would climb with, given the current status of the meta, where you can just play Avalanche Ravine into like Teemo Zoe, or you can ramp into She Who Wanders, and you're just the biggest control deck out there, because there's really no control deck that can realistically deal with Field Rush into like Tryndamere, right? I will say that Kayn Vayne is surprising to me to be the third deck. I think this is due to the fact, again, because of control decks resurfacing, Vayne just acting as free attacks, potential rallies. That's the kind of things that control decks like Field Rush definitely fear. I think the ability to also just level up Kayn, recall it with strikes to sort of avoid vengeances and stuff like that also make it pretty okay. And I do believe that this deck does also run Okay, so it doesn't seem to run the So it doesn't seem to run Expanse Protection, the spell shield, but you notice that there's 3 copies of Heedless Resurrection. So definitely looking out for these control decks. And if you look at this, you know, in the past, you might see like more copies of Unforgiving Cold, maybe Expanse Protection, but now you just see that shift towards the Heedless Resurrection, as I think that it's definitely a nod towards more control decks and just looking to outgrind them by bringing back champion after champion after champion and essentially demanding removal with every copyright. Overall, again, Trundle Tryndamere, Heimer Jace, you know, what's this? Ravenbloom, actually doing okay. But then you notice that there's a little bit of a fall off here with Echo Jinx, Draven Jinx. Even Seraphine Victor, I think that's gone down a little bit. I do think that Seraphine overall has really been impacted. And I will agree, and I will still admit that I think that Vayne overall got a slightly less tap than Seraphine. And if you notice that, you know, in this top 10 decks, there's only one Seraphine deck. And again, this is really just a Shadow Isles control deck at the end of the day. But again, I think you still notice some decks still lingering around, like Elite, the Gwen Katarina deck, still very, very popular and quite strong actually. Again, into these like Shadow Isles control decks where you have the hollowed stacks. And something you can kind of just leverage where almost any unit you can play and can stake just becomes a threat. If you level up Katarina, you can just like bring back Katarina through like Eternal Dancers. And again, this idea of rally into control has always been one of the problems for SI control decks overall. Even like Annie Jin, which was like the 4th most played deck in the past 7 days, has now dropped to 11, barely above a 50% win rate. And everything else I think is sort of staying stable. Yeah, just a ton of decks that I think you've seen here that are still just like around the same place. Definitely a shift in the top few, definitely nod towards more of these control decks and a little away from the aggressive decks. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about the meta, I'm sure the next question is, what should I play in this meta to have the best chance of success on ladder? And of course, if you look at the top 2 decks, Teemo Zoe and Trundle Tryndamere, you know, those are going to definitely be recommendations that I have for you guys, just because I think they're both very strong. Teemo Zoe can beat a lot of the matchups that I think try to counter it, such as this Trundle Tryndamere, right? If you have Avalanche, you can definitely buff your units out of range. You can just go wide, you play like Sudden Surge and things like that, and you can just kind of cheese your way out of your opponent. Trundle Tryndamere, for the same reason of it's just very good into these kind of swarm decks. You can kind of just pick out random wins. You're good into control decks, you're good into swarm, you're good into aggro for the most part. And overall, you just have a pretty good time. But now if we look into these top 2 decks and wonder about what's actually good into them, you notice that there's going to be some pretty similar sort of matchup tables. You notice that this Teemo Zoe deck is pretty weak into this removal kind of game plan. It's weak into aggro, but it's also weak into Gwen Katarina, and still okay into Vayne. But mostly this Gwen Katarina deck is the one that I want to point out because that's also pretty common into the Trundle Tryndamere as well. We notice Gwen Katarina also being this 60-40. This Vayne deck up here just being an absolute truck, being one of its worst matchups overall. So I think if you're looking for an answer into the top 2 decks, you have the Vayne decks, you have the Gwen Katarina, and I think that's going to be a really, really good choice going in. Outside of this, it's sort of a triangle here and there. This you can play like Catalog to beat the Teemo Zoe as well, but you absolutely fold to the Trundle Tryndamere deck. You can play like Seraphine Victor, but you notice that again, just an absolute poor display into this Gwen Katarina. And so I have some decks here that I do want to recommend. Of course, we have this classic Teemo Zoe. I'm not going to talk about this very much, but just the ability to go wide, the chimes kind of buff units out of range, and just the Battle Bonds, Lodestone, Sudden Surge, Pale Cascade buffs. I was playing Purple Berry Shake. Interesting. I don't recall Purple Berry Shake being a good card in this deck. Yeah, let's not do that. Let's Unblessed Vigor is interesting. I think there's one with like Shield Vault, so you have some flex slots, but having 3 Battle Bonds is definitely what I think makes this deck absolutely just fold these control decks. Like you try to quiet it onto battle bonds, or you try to like avalanche on the battle bonds, you just can't do it. And I think that's what easily just crushes some other decks. Now you have sudden surge to deal 5, you have pale cascades, you have equipments, you have buffs, you have chimes. It's just very good into removal decks because damage based removal is just not very reliable into this deck. And single target removals, like if you're trying to vengeance things, then you're just trading up so much mana. So Teemo Zoe definitely the #1 pick, although it's not a deck that I would enjoy playing. I would say it's probably one of the stronger by sheer power levels. You just have to be a little bit careful into like the removal decks, but I'm sure if you just have good hands and play safe into control decks, then you can have a pretty good time as well. Moving on, we have the SI Freljord Trundle Tryndamere. This is very flexible. So you notice this one has 2 Withering Wails. I'd probably run just more ramp in place of this. Withering Wail is not really good into any of the decks right now. It's really only good into like sheer aggro. So let me change this list as well. I'm sorry, I'm just pulling some bad lists. 2 Quietus, Flash Freeze. This guy's playing Troll Scavengers, which is interesting. I might just pull my list. Let me do that. I'm sorry. This could be prepared slightly better. Okay. And you have some flexible options, right? You have cards like Bird and Ice, you have Voice of the Old Ones that are very greedy and they can easily be replaced for other control cards like Ruination. You can play Kindly Tavern Keeper, you can play more units, you can put in some more freezes. I have a copy of Box just to really punish these like swarm decks, and this, again, easily replaceable, right? Which is, I think, one of the strengths of Trundle Tryndamere. Not only does it just do very, very well into both smaller control decks as well as more swarmy aggressive decks, it just has the ability to be tacked. If you play into more like Kane Vayne or whatnot, just put in more freezes, and you can really use that to slow the game down in something like She Who Wanders, right? So definitely a very, very flexible deck. This one is definitely a lot greedier with the ramp into She Who Wanders. So you can try to cut this out, but it's the list that I was playing and I think it does pretty well. Next up, we have I believe two Vayne decks. So the first one, Kane Vayne. This one is relatively new onto my radar. But just overall, cultist cards are just very, very powerful. And I think that just being able to abuse them is quite good. This one isn't actually playing this list isn't playing the Heatless Resurrection, so definitely slightly less nod into control, but something like Bloodcursed Harpy, still very, very phenomenal into control. Having the scout units plus Vayne Tumble is really key. So you notice that 6 copies of scout units here just to act as tumble targets into control decks is very, very powerful and acting like a rally. And I believe that that's really why this deck is trying to abuse Cataclysm. You could play this deck with Heatless Resurrection as well, and I think that would work just fine. But this one definitely trying to abuse the scout units plus Vayne to just apply a lot of pressure into control decks. Now, even into aggro decks, you have Keeper of the Box as a little bit of lifesteal, and just Broadwing, Challengers, Control, Single Combat, Strike Spells, and whatnots. Next up, the Vayne Quinn deck. This one has been floating around since last patch as well, in a sort of similar spot, but definitely one that plays a lot more for board, using the harp in combination with challengers such as Fleet Feather Tracker, Valor, Petricide Broadwing, just to act as removal tools. And just really aiming to just take control of the board. So very, very more similar to a deck like Scouts, that applies pressure through value trades, things like MF plus challengers. And in a very similar vein, this one does some very similar things to that. And onto the next deck, we have the Elise Katarina Gwen deck. This deck is just solid, right? It's good into the SI control decks. It's good into the Teemo Zoe decks, and it just has just very, very strong cards and game plans, right? If you can level Katarina, that's such a huge deal. If you can bring back Katarina from Eternal Dancers, also a big deal. You have Harrowing as a game ender against any sort of like control deck or removal based deck. Just great finisher into things like the catalog deck that really has no way of stopping a Harrowing. And you still have the ability to play like Quietus, Flock, just nice tempo tools. Probably I might put this as my #1 recommendation for the climb if you guys are looking for a deck. The second one might be Feel the Rush. And then overall, just solid all around are probably Teemo Zoe. But for going into this week, I think this deck is definitely one of the top performers in my mind. Lastly, I'll leave off with 2 Ionia decks because I think Ionia also has a good spot into the SI control decks, while also being good into the Vayne decks as well as the Gwen Katarina. This one is my personal favorite, the Katarina Yasuo. And with abundance of stuns, with Deny Stop Harrowings, Ruinations, Field Rushes, and cards like Intimidating Roar, especially in this meta where it's a lot of go wide strategies like the Gwen Katarina, the Teemo Zoe. It's a very, very good shutdown card into a lot of these strategies. You have the Rune Squire, one of the new cards that I have added as a little bit extra control tool, Challenger into things like the Elusives, into like just any deck overall, especially when you compare with either Flock, Twin Discipline, or any of the Blade Fragments, is very, very powerful. And of course, into SI control decks as well, you have the ability to level Katarina, add pressure to that with extra rallies, Fate Blade Twirlers, denies, and overall just very, very solid in my mind. And then lastly, I think just a little bit more of a experimental one. We have Akshan Lee Sin, definitely a deck that has been nerfed over and over again, but I think its strength still lies in the fact that it is an Ionia deck at the end of the day, and it has a very, very solid game plan against SI control decks. So if you're looking for something a little bit more Ionian into specifically the SI control decks, this is actually pretty decent, just because you can still have the ability to give Lee Sin Spell Shield. Nothing's really changed in its game plan. It is a little bit slower, but in most cases into SI control decks, that really doesn't actually matter. And overall, still just decent. If you can play this deck at a high level, I'm sure you can still do well into the Gwen Katarina list as well. So there you have it, a little bit of a dive into the snapshot of the meta, as well as some decks that I would recommend you guys take a look at when considering what you guys want to play on ladder this week. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Let me guys know if this was helpful, fun, educational, whatever it might be. If you want to see more of it, I can do something more entailed to this, and I think it's kind of interesting as well. So let me guys know if you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.